This week on Two Legs.
We are talking about the unknown McCartney with our guest Ian Peel, so stay tuned. Hi, McCartney fans, and welcome to another edition of Two Legs, a Paul McCartney podcast. We are a Paul McCartney talk show mainly dealing with the solo career of Paul McCartney, and I'm one of your two co-hosts, Tom Hunyadi, and you may know me from my other show, Talk More Talk, where me and my three co-hosts just banter about all things solo Beatles. And as always, I am joined by my partner in crime, my backwards traveler, the one and only Andy Nichols. Andy, what's going on?
Happy Sunday, my friend.
Yeah, happy Sunday. All's well with you?
Yeah, all's well. Thanks for hooking up another episode here and looking at diving into a really, really cool book and having a great author to join us today. So cool.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this one. As you can see, we have a guest here again, and we're talking about this book right here. It's the Unknown McCartney. This is McCartney and the Avantgarde, and we are joined by its author, Mr. Ian Peel. Ian, welcome to the show, and thanks for being here.
Good afternoon from sunny England. It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me on. After all this time, I wrote the book 18 years ago. It's taken
I mean, this book came out in 2002, and I don't think there was this many Beatles or Beatles related podcasts at the time for you to hop on and promote the book. Was there not?
Well, that's the funny thing, because I don't think there were any podcasts.
Right.
And of course, it came out in 2002, so I wrote it in like 2001 and 2000. So 20 years ago, there wasn't a lot of online media like that.
Right.
Really. And
exactly.
There's Spotify, or really particularly much YouTube. To kind of go digging into archive tracks and what have you. So. Yeah, It was interesting. I was thinking about it earlier. The book was written pre-internet, really. Getting CDs off of people and talking to people on the phone, and old school.
Right. Cool. Well, before we get into that, because this book really is a first of its kind. There really hasn't been any books that talked about this side of Paul McCartney. Really, but Andy, were you going to say something?
Well, yeah, to that point, which you're kind of hinting on there, Thomas, and I was going to save this for later, but we might as well ask it now. Is I've always felt his official book, his biography by Miles, touches on a lot of this period, which I believe was published, I think, in '97. I think so. Your book comes out 5 years later. So I was just very curious, the Avantgarde, and Miles obviously went to great lengths to talk about this period in Paul's life, and starting around '66, and all that kind of stuff that he had done, funding the newspaper, the Times, and all that stuff.
Plus, he was involved with Zapple. He's also got another book called the Zapple Diaries, which I recommend as well.
So I find it very interesting in the timeline of Beatles literature and the text. You've got this official book that comes out in '97 or '98, and then your book comes out a few years later. So it's just looking at I like to study the history of Beatles writings, not just the content, just to see the trend of how things go. And that's your book kind of follows up this pretty nicely.
It's interesting because obviously, you see, I didn't interview McCartney when I was writing the book. I wanted to. And I felt like I got pretty close to it. You know, I used to speak to his publicist, you know, like every week for about a year. It felt like
Jeff Baker.
Jeff Baker, yeah. It got to one point, I think, because Jeff would say, "Oh, phone any time. You know, Paul's, you know, he's on tour, and like maybe he can talk to you after the show tonight." And I phoned him up at one point. And he said, "Yeah, I'm in LA. I'm in the Bath. You know, everyone's just come off stage, but you know, Paul will be along." You know, he kept me hanging.
Yeah.
You know, for quite a long time. And funny thing was, I remember saying to Jeff Baker. And he said, "Oh, remind me again about the book. Remind me about the book." I said, "Well, it's about Paul's avant-garde music or his experimental music." And at one point, he just flat out said, "Well, it's been done. It's been written." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he meant the Miles book. And I had to say, well, you know, the Miles book is great. And obviously, Miles was there in the 60s and in Napoleon.
But correct me if I'm wrong, that just covers the Beatles period, though, right?
Well, this is what I said to Jeff. I said, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's like 10% of the story.
Right.
He recorded these giant kind of, or rather, he's recorded these giant lumps of experimental work post-Beatles. And I said, this is the whole picture. You know, this is everything. And he was like, "Oh, okay, I get it." But of course, the interview didn't happen. But it was funny because the first thing he mentioned was Miles. But really, you know, what is there to speak of in terms of McCartney's avant-garde work in the 60s? You know, not a lot.
Right. It's all been after that period, and there's been no attention paid to it. Therein lies one of my big kind of gripes about anything written about McCartney. Nearly any of his general biographies is 90% Beatles and 10% on his own solo career, let alone touching even the avant-garde stuff. So, you know, it's such a missing gap. So that's why your piece is a welcome addition to the canon, really.
And so it was exciting for me as well, because I think I even said it like in the intro. You know, if you even if like a McCartney solo biog, if 10% of it is solo McCartney,
right,
it's going to be 0.5% experimental stuff. But what I tried to say was, you know, and people argue about this, but if you say that the definitive Beatles album is Sgt. Pepper or Abbey Road, and if you say that the definitive Wings album is, you know, Band on the Run, I'm just looking behind Tom for inspiration. I'll go Band on the Run. But if I was to pick a solo McCartney classic to sit alongside, you know, Pepper and Band on the Run, I'd pick Rush's. And I love that album. I thought it was absolutely fantastic and like completely emotionally charged, you know. And so the fact that like my favorite McCartney album never even got a mention in any books, I thought, well, here's the door.
Here's the perfect opportunity. Okay, so before we even get to that, let's just talk about you for a second. You said before we started recording, or you said you started writing the book around 2001. So take us straight up to that point. Talk about your professional career up to that point, and you know, what were you doing, and you know, and what inspired. You know, obviously, you know, we talked a little bit about what inspired this book, but what were you doing professionally up until this point?
Well, up until that point, I mean, my first sort of love is music writing, the music journalism. So, you know, I'd been doing that since before I left school. So there's a magazine in the UK called Record Collector, and started writing for them when I was at school. And they started publishing my articles the summer after I left school. And, you know, I've kept on writing about music, you know, ever since. It's quite hard to have a sort of professional career around that. So I've kind of gone on into the flip side of that, which is marketing. But yeah, music writing was really, you know, my thing. So the Record Collector stuff led to writing for lots of different magazines, and writing for one particular magazine led to writing a book. And then this is even kind of again, kind of like a bit out there or before its time. It was a book called Music and the Internet. It sounds sort of really topical and useful, but it came out in 1995, so it was possibly a bit before its day. But after I wrote that, I really had the bug. I really had the bug for writing and writing, long form even more. So I remember at the time just being really, thirsty for a great story. And that combined with loving rushes and seeing the doorway into, the unexplored McCartney, I thought, well, this is great. That's a great opportunity.
Well, how were you introduced to that world of the avant-garde music? Two sort of things. One is into like avant-garde music, and one into like avant-garde McCartney. Well, the avant-garde music one, that's really hard to say, but I suppose really, one of my first loves and one of those first articles I wrote back, a long time ago when I was at school, was about a record label in the UK called ZTT, which is Trevor Horn's label that brought the world Art of Noise and Propaganda and lots of things like that. And I thought that was breathtaking, really. When I heard that music, and consequently ended up working with Trevor for the label and with groups like Art of Noise and Propaganda, some years later. But to me, that was like a great, that was like pop and avant-garde at the same time, which was clever. And then, for the avant-garde McCartney, and so of course that like really steered, my worldview of music. But when I was at college, I remember a friend of mine's dad was McCartney's accountant, and we weren't like huge fans, but we would talk about McCartney, and he told me once, he said, "You never guess what my dad brought home from work." He said, "Paul McCartney's recorded a whole album of like instrumental techno." And I was like, wow, that's brilliant, because instrumental techno was what we listened to all the time. So we said, let's go and have a listen to that, and that was Strawberries, Oceans, Ships, Forests. And this is right here.
There it is.
We could talk about that in depth, and some people call it like heavy going, but I thought it was brilliant.
Well, so your friend's dad then realized that was McCartney before anybody else knew that the fireman was McCartney.
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah, because obviously it was all shrouded in mystery, wasn't it, for a long time?
Especially in 1993, of course. How are you going to know then, really?
Yeah, no, I mean, so I suppose I hadn't really thought of that, actually. The first time I heard of it, I knew who it was.
No.
And I was aware of it as a producer, because if you were going to clubs in 1992 in the UK, you were dancing to and listening to lots of his productions.
Okay.
So he was a bit of a genius, already, as far as I was concerned. So
right.
So yeah, interesting pathways.
Cool. So, but then, so take us up to then now 2001. You got the idea to dive into. I mean, were you a fan of it? Did you go back and listen to McCartney's back catalog out before writing the book? Just to get a sense of McCartney's material.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. And of course there were certain bits of McCartney that I knew inside out. But I'd never kind of dived headlong, into everything. So for example, my parents had Classic Wings albums and Beatles albums. There were singles and 12 inches of solo McCartney that I had and got into. And then here's the thing about writing a book pre-internet. How do you dive into the full works? It was hard, and it was expensive. So I just like bought every CD, you know, I could. And I don't have them, but do you remember those CD reissues from, I suppose they were like late 90s of all the McCartney solo?
Oh, the McCartney collection.
McCartney collection.
Yes,
Someone
yeah. Yeah, those guys right there.
All these, yeah.
Went and bought all of those.
Right.
You know, just to be sure I was on top of everything. I mean, now it'd be so incredibly easy.
Right.
There's probably a playlist called The Complete McCartney, and you just stream all 1,000 tracks, and you know, that's that. But yeah, no, so it was really interesting. I knew that with the Fireman and like my love of that kind of thread of music and like my interest in McCartney and this sort of thirst to write this book, all of that was enough to convince this Reynolds and Hearn, the people that
yeah, and that was going to be my next question, you know, talking about you know, pitching an idea like this to a publisher, because you know, a lot of authors that we've had on the show, they talk about how it's a lot harder pitching an idea about a solo Beatle rather than a book on the Beatles.
Right.
And you know what I mean. And so was it a difficult thing to you know, pitch the idea to get the book made?
I don't know. I'm not sure that it was. They loved the idea. I'm not really in touch with Reynolds or Hearn anymore, but you know, they pop up. So Andrew Hearn, he's quite a prolific author of Doctor Who related material. Nice. I'll sometimes see him, you know, online. But Richard Reynolds was the main guy that dealt with me, you know, and he was lovely. And I didn't like, you know, contact very many publishers. And so he was one of the first ones. And he came straight back to me. By this stage, I'd been writing for a magazine called DJ every 2 weeks, like, I don't know, you know, for about 5 years or so. And I don't know if he was trying to be nice, but he said he knew me. You know, he said he knew my writings. And he said to meet him in a patisserie in Old Compton Street in London. And it was, and straight off he said he thought it was a fantastic idea, and you know, they'd love to get behind it. You know, they're a new publisher. They had me writing about McCartney, and they had someone else writing a kind of encyclopedia about the Smiths. And
cool.
We both went.
I might have that. I might have that over there.
Yeah,
I'm a big Smiths fan. I'm a big Smiths fan as well.
Yeah. And they were fantastic, actually. And I think by the time the book came out, Richard Reynolds was teaching Central St. Martin's, which is a university in London. And he got me down one evening to just talk to his students about how not to be afraid to write things that are longer than, you know, 500 words. And he said, look, here's this guy that's just written, I don't know, you know, 150 words about McCartney. And he played sax to sort of blow the students' minds and talked about the book. So yeah, no, they're brilliant publishers. They got bought out by a company called Titan, I think. And yeah.
Ian, how long did the research process take for the book?
I worked on it pretty much solidly for about a year at least.
Okay.
It was intense. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's like, you know, we talked about pre-internet days. It's just like, you got this, you know, this idea, you want to get it out, but, you know, not a lot is known about it. So it's like, you know, where do you start, you know?
Yeah, it's hard. And the way you started was where people don't start so much now, the best place to start, which is just talking to people who were there. You know, so I was sort of flicking back through the book this morning, and you know, funnily enough, the first chapter that I wrote is chapter like 4-ish, which is the Carnival of Light one. Because I thought, well, let's cut to the chase.
Well, you were familiar with Carnival of Light prior to writing the book, then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was just because it was just such a legend, or is still such a legend. And I thought, you know, when McCartney wasn't talking, and So, but the guy that I did interview, who was there at the time, David Vaughan, Binder, Edwards, and Vaughan, who are these kind of crazy out there artists who are putting on, the original raves and happenings, and he was just great, and of course he's passed away since then. And a lovely, really long interview, for the book, which obviously, and again, sorry, because your original question was like about how to go about researching it. Well, it was find an interesting person, spend ages trying to track them down. Eventually I was kind of arranging it, by phoning his wife, in the evenings, and then I eventually spoke to him all evening and taped the whole thing, and then spent a week transcribing it. It must be so easy now. You just like email 10 people.
Right.
But David Vaughan was brilliant, and he had he was there, so he had a strong view. And if I'm honest, his memories of Carnival of Light was that it was rubbish.
Yeah, right. That's kind of the word on the street, that it's just, you're going to have this big buildup, and then you're finally going to listen to it, and you're going to be like,
I mean,
maybe not.
The last known legendary Beatles track, when you know that it's it's not Hey Jude.
Right. And I'm sure the last person to listen to it was either, Lewison or Giles Martin.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, quite possibly. I mean, it obviously is pretty edgy and out there, because there's the classic story, isn't there, that they wanted to put it on one of the anthologies, and
right.
George.
Yes, Pepper.
And that's unfortunate. I kind of get the impression that you would imagine that McCartney would love to have it put out there.
And if it had come out on one of the anthologies, it may have, it wouldn't have been such a big event. Like, okay, it's on the anthology, and if it wasn't being promoted as this sacred holy grail of a lost Beatle,
right?
It could have just been thrown on Anthology 2, and they would have been done with it.
Exactly. See, that would have been the perfect time to release it. Was on Anthology 2. I mean, because now there's such a build-up over it. If it would have got released on the Sgt. Pepper 50th anniversary, I mean, he'd probably get torched, for, by now. I mean, but, he worked so hard to remind people that, he was the one that really got introduced, to the avant-garde world back in the mid-'60s, while he, stayed in London.
Yeah.
Whereas, even though Lennon and Harrison were releasing some avant-garde stuff, prior to McCartney, he really works hard these past decades, making sure people realize that
he's only done that post Lennon's death.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
A whole other thing.
So he wants everybody to know that he did the tape loops for, Tomorrow Never Knows, and, just, things like that, that people might not realize about McCartney. Whereas, Lennon, and, ever since, getting connected with Yoko Ono, they just assume that he's the avant-garde Beatle.
Well, this is and that's one of the reasons for writing the book.
Right.
Is to kind of redress that balance, really. But it's a weird balance to redress, because let's call it out. Lennon and Harrison dived into the avant-garde world, but straight away were releasing their results. With Two Virgins and Wonderwall music and electronic sound, like straight off there was a pretty brimming catalogue,
Right.
And bottom line is, and this is like in terms of solo Beatles, McCartney wasn't releasing that stuff. But the thing that's almost sort of frustrating to me is, of course, what really did George Harrison do of the avant-garde sort of nature after that? I can't really think of anything. And like, well, Lennon was with Yoko, but he was with Yoko like doing rock and roll. It's not like they carried on that, it was a Past the Wedding album.
Right. Cambridge
they
'69 or any of that stuff, you know.
Well, I mean, a few of the films that they may have done, you know, back, you know, 70, 71, you know, were more of the avant-garde style. But yeah, but recording wise,
Not music.
Yoko was continuing that with her own music that John was on. So Yoko, I mean, she was releasing, you know, albums in the 70s, you know, with their Plastic Ono, Fly.
But even those were pop albums. You know, those were
True, but you know, you still have her little. She still adds her little, you know, avant-garde flair to it.
True.
Yeah, I mean, it was weird, wasn't it? Because they were avant rock, you know, before there was such a thing, you know, like Mine Train and Approximately Infinite Universe,
right? Universe, yeah.
Yep. But so this is like so there's a strange balance to redress, which is where, you know, he kind of wasn't releasing in the 60s. Then, but so I suppose one of my ideas was that, well, unlike, you know, the other Beatles, who's you know, and even George Martin, you know, like, whose avant-garde interest kind of waned and mellowed, you know, McCartney's just kind of kept building up,
right,
and stepping up, and really hasn't gone away, and in actual fact is kind of flourished, really. But at the same time, I think the kind of slightly middle of the road brand that he might have got saddled with, he's kind of quite enjoyed building that up as well. So consequently, the avant-garde stuff has been under pseudonyms or no names, or you know. And that was, I suppose, like the other thread of the book, which is the other thread. There was one thread which is like, there's probably three threads. It's like, well, look at all this cool avant-garde stuff that Paul McCartney's done. The second thread was like, let's use it as a way to tread a path through that world, or the past few decades of that world. But the other, sort of point of it was like the fact that he'd done it under other names,
right?
You know, Fireman, etc., etc.
Yeah, because you know, with you know, you talk about in the book early on. Yeah, we'll get to that in a few minutes too. You know, early on, you talk about stuff like from the McCartney album, like Glasses. You know, the Glasses segment from Hot as Sun. You know, Karina Core from McCartney too. You know, so you know, he does, starting with McCartney, start to kind of incorporate some of that stuff into his music. Yeah,
definitely. And in fact, that was one of the sort of discoveries from during the book, you know, the as opposed to from before. Because when I started writing it, I really thought there's going to be a set of kind of key points here, you know. There's going to be, you know, like a small one would be the family way, and there's going to be Rushes, there's going to be Fireman, and there's going to be Thrilling Turn, and you know, and I really thought, well, you've got to thread it together. We should do like a sort of generalist 70s chapter, and like a generalist sort of 80s chapter. But it was when I was doing those kind of generalist chapters to join it all up, was when I dived into the McCartney collection CDs. And I thought, hang on a minute, this all threads together quite nicely, actually.
Right.
You know, when you find Glasses, or the other thing that I loved was, you know, the broadcast on Back to the Egg. Yeah, I thought these are like killer moments, actually.
Right. Excuse me.
You know, a sort of a real thread, and sometimes the thread is minimized,
right,
and sometimes it's, you know, magnified.
Right,
in his career.
Yeah. Other tracks you talk about in the book throughout the 70s, one being Picasso's Last Words, which, you know, at the, you know, the mid to, you know, end segment where you just get the, you know, these fragments of, you know, other songs that were on Band on the Run, which, you know, you really didn't hear much before, especially from McCartney. You know, and then you also got Loop, which, you know, again, from Red Rose Speedway, which, you know, again, you know, experimenting with that as well, those kinds of sounds as well.
There's a great compilation CD or box set, really, now you mention it, just waiting to be made.
Yeah, right.
All of these pieces, you know. So I remember, like, on the Back to the Egg one, I interviewed Lawrence Juba, who again was really good and had great tales of of how they recorded. And again, that sort of joined the dots, you know, because he was talking about, I can't remember if it was a vocal sound or a guitar sound, where he was like standing in a fireplace or at the foot of a stairwell or something to get the sort of necessary amount of reverb that they wanted for a particular track. And I think that was actually like a sort of a technique that they used on Thrillington as well, for certain instruments. The more you look at it, the more it, you know, the more it all joins up, and it sounds like we're talking about really random things here, but there is a thread.
There is a connection to all of it, and then, you know, leading up to him to finally. Well, go ahead, Andy. You got something?
No, go ahead. I'll save it.
Okay. Well, I mean, you know, you get all these, you know, these little threads, these little pieces, you know, throughout the 70s, and then, you know, now 1980 coming, you know, with McCartney 2, you know, it's just, he just, you know, gives you everything, but, you know, including the kitchen sink, you know, and, you know, I sometimes wonder, because it did do well in the charts. I think in the UK, it did better in the UK than it did here in the States, but then it also got panned a lot. So I think maybe that, if that maybe influenced him to, when he would return to the world of avant-garde, to use a different name.
Yeah, that's true. Are we talking about like Temporary Secretary and all of that kind of when McCartney
and all that stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you get, you know, coming up, but other than that, I mean, a lot of this stuff is just, you know, it might take a couple years. I remember the first time I heard McCartney 2. And, you know, besides like maybe 2 or 3 songs, I just like, I put that off to the side and said, well, maybe I'll get to that another time, you know.
And this is where he's interesting and in such a sort of unique position, really, which is, you know, I don't think, I was reading like a quote the other day, it might have been around like the Ringo 80th birthday stuff. And I think there's this, John Lennon once said something like that, you know, all Ringo wanted, you know, after the Beatles was a #1. You know, wanted to have a #1, and I think when you've gone through what they all went through, I think McCartney, you know, he still wants to have a #1 album when he does a new album, and I think that is, especially these days, maybe it is going to sort of shape what is a McCartney album and what is not a McCartney album. But at the same time, he can't sort of shake these interests, yeah, sort of passions. So.
Right. Well, and it's kind of interesting too. Then, you know, talking about that, you know, what's a McCartney album? Where, you know, then you get to the Fireman albums, where you know, those first 2, you know, Strawberries and Rushes. You know, we have no idea it's McCartney, but then, you know, when Electric Arguments comes out, I mean, it's all, you know, promoted, you know, McCartney, you know, which I found to be interesting, you know.
Curious on your take on that, Ian.
It was an interesting twist, wasn't it? But then, you know, wow, if you listen to Electric Arguments and compare it to Strawberries, they're like chalk and cheese, really.
Yes.
You know, the Fireman had gone on a journey itself from sort of like 60 minutes of brutal, repetitive techno to kind of, you know, rock.
You know, almost like a proper pop album, really.
Yeah, pretty much was, wasn't it? And this is why I'd sort of, and of course that came out after the book, and I don't know whether, I've always quite fancied, you know, going back and having another stab at this book, because there's probably been like 3 or 4 projects that have come out since that are out.
Yeah, and that was going to be a further question down the line, to see if you were, you know, indeed thinking about revisiting, you know, this, you know, the idea of, you know, of the avant-garde McCartney.
I'd love to, but there's like a reason for it and there's a reason against it. The reason for it is things like Twin Freaks and Electric Arguments and like.
Yeah, we got like, you know, Bloody Beetroots that they, you know, collaborated with. You know, there's the Charlotte Gainsbourg album, which, you know, they got Somberg in a Cage, which I think is pretty interesting. And then, you got London Underground as well, which I think is a fascinating collaboration with Sawhney.
I mean, there's all this. There's probably a whole load more stuff that continues the story. It could be great. That's the reason for it. I suppose the reason against it is it's really heavy going. Like writing books.
Right.
Tell us about the origins of Hiroshima Sky is Always Blue and the Yoko Ono connection and interviewing her and how that all came about.
Well, here's the thing. I was and am a big Yoko fan. So when I realised that I could weave Yoko into a McCartney book legitimately, musically, I thought, well, this is great. So there's this one track that that they did together, and here's the funny thing, because although it was pre-internet-ish writing this book, I managed to get a copy of it. I don't know how I got a copy of that, because it hasn't been released, has it?
You're talking about Hiroshima Sky is Always Blue, right?
Yes.
Yeah, apparently, from my understanding, it's the only official release here. Give me 1 second to bring it up. Was from it's in Hiroshima, and it's at the Hiroshima Museum of Contemporary Arts, and you can only get it in the gift shop. It's on a CD, and it's part of a book that you have to buy at the gift shop, and I think that's the only way you can get it.
No,
but you can listen to it on YouTube.
You can, these days. And so it was in the gift shop, but also it was used on a TV documentary in Japan about the launch of that
the 50th anniversary. Of the bomb.
That's right. And then so I think I managed to get a VHS from a fan, so I could have a listen, who'd had a copy of that documentary. And it is quite emotional listening to it, isn't it? Because Yoko speaks at the start of the track, and although it was recorded in
Hog Hill,
like early 90s, maybe early
94ish, right?
I think it says 95 at Hog Hill.
Right. So Yoko and family visited Paul and family,
right,
in the 90s, and decided to have a jam. And that's the track that resulted. But of course, what sort of makes it really emotional and intimate is she begins the recording by speaking to John.
Yeah, we're here together. I thought that was very moving. It's very moving.
I mean, when I heard it, I was like, wow, okay, this is not what I expected. And then I suppose secondly, they went full avant-garde, didn't they, for the jam? It wasn't avant rock. It was just very sort of loose, free form improvisation with all the family members involved. I thought it was great.
Yeah. So Paul I think Paul was on upright bass. I think Sean was on a Moog. If I'm not a Moog, but harpsichord. I think it was, and then Linda, I think, did some keyboard work, and then I think James' guitar, and then the McCartney girls were all backing vocals, I believe.
Right, fantastic. So, and that was another sort of thing, another sort of point for the book, which is at the time, maybe less so these days, but at the time in the media, Paul and Yoko were just portrayed as at each other's throats, pretty much constantly.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, great, let's have a chapter that proves the complete opposite. Talks about them making a really cool track together. So that's the story of that. The story of talking to Yoko is a bit funny, because I tried to sit down and have a long chat with her, and she said no. But I'd been to a Yoko exhibition at the South Bank, and there was this, which I found really inspirational. So I put it to her, I think there was something in the Yoko exhibition, you know, about the number of thoughts per day that people have, and so I said, well, look, we'll do a word play to sort of pick up on the early sort of John Yoko heart play thing, and I'll borrow 5 of your thoughts out of your, you know, billion thoughts per day or whatever it was that was in the exhibition. And so I sent her 5 words, or I sent her a word, and she sent me a word back, and I sent her another word back, and she sent me another word back, until we'd sort of joined up this thing. And in a way, you know, it's not a very lengthy interview, but it's pretty telling, you know, what comes back.
Right.
Yeah,
you also got to talk to youth for the book. You got to talk to Nitin Sawhney, I believe, and then members of Super Furry Animals.
Yeah. So this was, I suppose that was more sort of, because at the time, you know, writing for DJ Mag, like all 3 of those were, you know, were in my orbit a little bit. Gruff Reese from Super Furry Animals, he was good, but he was brief by comparison to youth. We spoke a lot, and you know, he was fantastic. So I went round to youth's house, and I think I'd said, you know, it'll only take an hour or something. He had this great sort of huge sort of office stroke studio, and he sat down in the middle of the floor on a giant beanbag, and you know, 4 hours later we were still talking. You know, it was great, and there was none of that sort of who is the fireman type secrecy. He just loved working with Paul and wanted to talk about it.
Right.
And yeah, he was really, really good, and it was great to spend the time. I think he's done, at the time, I don't think he'd really done any fireman interviews at all. I see him pop up, and he does them every now and then now.
Right.
And obviously around electric arguments, you know, they were everywhere. But at the time, I thought, wow, you know, we're really blowing the lid here on.
At that time, sure, because it was really, again, you know, was not as well known then.
Right.
No, really not at all. And Nitin Sawhney was brilliant, because I love those clear vinyl 12-inch mixes that he did from the Rushes album. You know, I thought they were really good. I thought they were really enjoyable to listen to, but I thought it was really cool that he was McCartney saying, right, let's have a drum and bass remix of one of my tracks. You know, and kind of exploring that was impressive.
Right.
I think.
And I think he probably exposed a lot more people to it, with his, especially since his touring post 2002, because I know he used a lot of that music as pre-show music before his concerts, right?
Yeah, in fact, I think, and that I suppose that's why like books are annoying, because as soon as they're out, they're old.
Right.
Literally, the tour that started within months of it coming out, I think the pre-show music was all Firemen, or
something like that. Right.
That would have been great to put in. And the other thing that he did, and this was uncanny, really, which was like literally the month that the book came out, was when he did that TV advert for, I think, BBC Radio 2, which was like an avant-garde remake of a particular track. Do you remember that?
No.
He's like running pennies down the strings of a piano and like resonating with glasses of water. I'll try and find it while we talk.
Yeah, because I know he did. I know he revisited the glasses bit when he did the Chaos and Creation special, which I think was on the at Abbey Road.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to try and find this because it's it might be hard to find. I'll come back to you on that one. It was weird though. Literally everything that I'd been telling people that was going to be in this book, and that it was going to be all, you know, unknown McCartney. Literally, when it came out, he's doing a TV ad, doing all of this crazy stuff and talking about it. I'm sure it was for Radio 2.
I'm sure that was all on purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just one of
So,
those main things.
yeah, moving, fast forwarding to 2000, we got the Liverpool sound collage,
Yeah.
which then reunites them with youth, and then super furry animals, working a bit on this as well. What are your thoughts on this project?
I loved it. I mean, to me, that was like the third Fireman album, really.
Yeah.
And really interesting album because, I mean, for starters, like the youth track on there, which I'm sure is something like 15 minutes long, isn't it? Or it's a really long album.
Let's see here. That one is 1637.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that's an amazing piece. And
Right.
when I gave that, did that sort of talk or seminar, with Richard Reynolds' students, and we were playing them tracks from the album, that was to try and blow their minds. That was one of the tracks.
Right.
We played, and it worked.
I'm sure it did.
Their minds. I think that's a fantastic piece. But also, Free Now it's like almost like a single.
Right.
It's like a single. And I do remember at the time, this came out about 2000. This was a little more in the conscious of the Paul McCartney brand. Like, hey, this is out there. Much more so than
The
Strawberry
first two Firemen. Yeah.
This was much more in the consciousness of the Beatle Paul world of like, hey, he's done this experimental thing. Check it out. Whereas with Strawberries and Rushes, you didn't have that.
No,
Now, did you like that on first listen, Andy, or did it take you a little while to get used to it?
No, I liked it right away.
I enjoyed it right off the bat too. I thought it was really cool. I like how he mixed the some of the Beatles stuff in there as well. It's really far out.
Yeah, that's the one where he goes around in the street recording people.
Exactly.
High.
Yeah.
Which is a really sort of clever thing to do, and it's the sort of thing that only someone really in his position can do in terms of the kind of stuff people will come up to him and say.
Right.
So I think that's great.
Yeah, let's switch gears a little bit to this guy right here, Thrillington, because I mean I don't know of a musician that did anything like this, just took a whole album of theirs and decided, hey, let's just turn it into a whole instrumental, classical piece, if you will, and then let's not say who it is either. It's a completely different somebody else,
I mean, that's a classic, and I was reading the sort of intro to the book earlier, and I was kind of at pains to include Thrillington, in this book, because really you can't really call it avant-garde music.
Right.
No.
It's like intentionally easy listening. It's like it's kind of the opposite of avant-garde music. But it fits under the unknown McCartney thing, because more so than the Firemen, I think Thrillington really sort of flew under the radar from what I understand.
Right.
At least not forever, but for a period of time, and that he had a lot of fun sort of disguising who it was, and and playing. And also, you could kind of say that it is an avant-garde masterstroke to take a hit rock and roll album and reinvent it as an easy listening big band jazzy type. And again, I think like Richard Houston was saying, they were recording. Was that the album, I think, where they invented the watery box, which was like like literally a box of water, that they played an instrument into, and obviously sort of bent the sound, as they moved the box with the water. So it's kind of edgy, sort of production in itself. So I don't know, I would say I'm a big Thrillington fan, for what it is.
Yeah, exactly, for what it is. Go ahead, Andy.
I've always been kind of perplexed with the release of it, because as we found out, it was included in the RAM archive. As a time, because it was released in '77, but it was recorded back when the album was being made. So you just wonder why, in that timeline in his discography, he chose to just drop that anonymously in 1977.
Well, he dropped a lot of projects, you know, unexpectedly. I mean, just like the Bruce McMouse animated thing, you know, they did that and they just dropped it, you know. So who knows why, you know, an artist just decides to drop a project after it's done. I mean, look at all those Neil Young albums that didn't come out in the 70s that have been, you know, finally trickling out now over the last decade. But it is interesting though.
Like putting it out in 77, like, so putting out your most intentionally middle of the road product you could ever come out with at the height of punk rock in 77, just like, I think that's hilarious.
Yeah.
You know, so I think the Thrillington album's there's lots of stories around it. And what I really enjoyed doing is I found someone who'd collected all of the little classified ads that he'd placed in the Evening Standard newspaper, saying who is Thrillington or call me.
Right.
And that's like the sort of tweets, isn't it? You know, really.
Yeah, you get that in the recent CD release.
Yeah, that's a recent one though. This is like an older.
Yeah.
This is an older one.
Yeah, this is the was it 2016 or something? 2018. 2018. This was.
Yeah, this one here is a 90.
I recognize that earlier one.
Yeah. That's the early one, yeah.
Right.
So
yeah, exactly. Go ahead, Andy.
So just like kind of on a larger question, kind of thing, like, you know, we've talked about the unknown McCartney, you know, and reasons for why, you know, do you think he enjoys like the unknown aspect of this kind of pseudo, like, I've done this stuff, but I don't want people to know about it, but I kind of do want people to know about it. It's kind of like a back and forth. What do you think about that?
That is a hard one, isn't it? Because you see, I'm no artist, but I would assume that if you were him, you would open the floodgates and embrace it all, and you know, and do the opposite really of what he's done, which is sort of compartmentalizing, you know, a lot of this stuff. As for, you know, does he enjoy it? Does he enjoy the kind of hiding away type process? He has to. Otherwise, you know, why would you put an album out under the name of Percy Thrills Thrillington and trade it with ads in the Evening Standard? There was a weird article about the book, actually, that came out about 5 years after. No, I think it was an article about McCartney, but it referenced the book. And it actually said in it, the article's in The Guardian, and it said something like, you know, McCartney's lack of involvement in Ian Peel's book implies a tacit approval of what he's done to, you know, it's almost, they basically said, well, because he didn't do an interview, that proves you know, that he wants all this stuff out there. And I was like, well, people make up their own stories, I think, if you've got a good story. Like, I mean, that's I thought that was hilarious.
Yeah, you could really read it both ways, couldn't you?
I was quite impressed that they would come up with something so oblique and read something into it. But yeah,
so I mean, people that aren't familiar with the book, and I'll show the book again. It's the Unknown McCartney. Before we started recording, you talked about this was the original cover, but you know, a couple other covers ended up finding their way out there as well.
Yeah, it's strange because this is, you know, to me, this is the cover. And it's a very cool cover, and
because then you use parts of the picture on the chapters as well.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, the artwork, and I must admit, I don't know who the publisher commissioned to do this artwork, but you know, I like it a lot. But
I dig it.
Funny thing is, and it stands up quite well now, doesn't it? You know, like all these years later, it still looks quite good. But they left the cover very late, and the book was delivered quite late. And I remember that like promotion started on the book probably as I was still sort of finishing it off. So the cover, so they put out, I think it was like a temporary cover, or it was like what the cover was going to be before they had this, you know, great idea. which is basically a photo of Paul McCartney in front of a reel-to-reel tape machine. But the weird thing is now, you know, if you Google it, that is still everywhere, that cover. I think because it got logged on Amazon from day one.
Yeah, see, and that's the cover I was expecting when I bought the book.
Right. But
and then, you know, this pops up and I'm like, is this like a second pressing or printing or what, you know?
Yeah, and you've got this one now. Yeah, you've got this one now.
Yeah.
That's the one that I mean. That was the early cover that never existed and was never printed.
Wow.
But it just because that was, you know, the JPEG that went online first.
Right.
20 years later, that's the cover of the book that people expect, but it was never printed onto the front of the book.
Wow.
Which is slightly odd. So there's like what I call the early cover, which is that Tape Machines one. There's the cover, which is that. And then weirdly, the whole publishing company was bought out, like maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And without any involvement from me, the new owners of the publisher did a Kindle edition and came up with a new cover.
Okay.
Like kind of 4 psychedelic pictures of McCartney across the top, 4 at the bottom, and some white text. It's okay.
That's the Kindle. That's the Kindle version, Ian.
Yeah. So I think again, if you Google, you might see that one. But I was kind of disappointed with that because I never saw it until it came out. If they were going to do a Kindle edition, wouldn't it have been great if they'd let me know? I could have added in another chapter.
Well, see, yeah, and that's going to say is this Kindle version still available?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Okay, so then I just lost my train of thought. So you know, revisiting this, then you said you would have, well, you know, wanted to write another chapter. So we briefly talked about that. You know, there's a lot of stuff, and you talked about the downsides and the upsides. I'm rooting for you to, you know, to do a part 2 to this.
Yeah.
You know, so for fans that are casual McCartney fans, and they're like, that stuff's crap. Why should they give McCartney's Avantgarde side a try or a listen?
Well, here's the thing. I think they should give it a try because it's quite good fun, you know, to be open-minded. So it's really enjoyable chatting to you guys because I think you know, no offense to some people, but I think some fans of McCartney or the Beatles could be quite dismissive of like everything that we're talking about. You know, 16 techno tracks and drum and bass and like you know, all of that stuff. But it's just more fun, really. You know, if you open your mind and you know,
relax and float downstream.
Yeah.
Exactly. And here's the thing, that like, I suppose the other reason to give it a go is because, you know, like weaving into all of this stuff are absolute gems, you know, like melodic gems, you know, and emotional gems. Like it's all there in Rushes, you know, like the guitar work, you know, like all the references to Linda, you know, that like how could you not want to delve into that side?
And if you're a true fan and you really, really want to truly discover what the person you really love is doing, why not? Why would you just close your mind or have a narrow view and not an open mind or an open say, look, okay, it's not going to be something you might listen to 6 days a week, but you should just at least, you know about it and try to just experience it and kind of just gain a better understanding of what this man is doing.
Yeah, you're totally right. It's like, and then again, maybe that's why people sort of you know, diverge because at the end of the day, sometimes you do just want to put an album on and listen to it and you know, really sort of enjoy it as you know, its immediacy. And I wouldn't say for a second that, you know, it's very rare that I think, do you know what, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to listen to both sides of Thrillington. You know, you know, I don't think I'd offend anyone involved in the making of it if, you know, I said that it was, you know, it was a rare evening, you know.
And speaking of Thrillington, I mean, you were able to talk to Richard Hewson about talk about that for a minute.
Well, Richard Hewson was fantastic, and he was so pleased that someone had figured out, you know, what Thrillington was, and even that he was involved. He had very, very fond memories of making it. You know, and he had lots of stories to tell, you know, about like the watery box, for example. But you know, the other thing that was really interesting about Richard Hewson is, again, you know, Thrillington's like a sort of, you know, it's like kind of a Muzak jazz thing. But it turns out that Richard Hewson is this, you know, has not stopped trying to innovate, you know, and to record. So, for example, if you cut forward to like 80s disco, Richard Hewson's right there. Do you remember that song called Clouds Across the Moon by the Ra Band? You might not remember that. It was like it was a sort of well, it wasn't a disco hit, it was sort of like a new wave hit in Europe. Well, the Ra Band, R-A-H band, that was Richard A. Hewson.
Okay.
So, wow. Yeah, there he was 10 years later. Richard Hewson had become the Ra Band, you know, and was having these kind of cool new wave hit records. And then after the interview, he said, "Oh, shall I send you some of my new stuff that I've been working on?" And I said, "Yeah, great. You know, I'd love to hear it." And it's like full-on club music.
Really
nice. Wow.
Who would have thought that the guy that McCartney held his feet to the fire with the long and winding road ended up doing that?
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to say. Because you know, a lot of people still don't realize that there's a connection with Hewson.
Absolutely.
You know, going back, you know, the prior year with the long and winding road. So.
Yeah, there was lots of connections, wasn't there? And of course, the other person it was really interesting to talk to for Thrillington was Herbie Flowers.
Okay.
Of course.
Because, you know, as bass players
player, fantastic bass player.
You know, I mean, his bass playing CV is, you know, it's just ridiculous.
Yes.
Of course, what's the classic Herbie Flowers? Walk on the Wild Side.
Yeah.
You know, is him. But again, here's the thing about like being interview based and being, you know, sort of telephone or face to face based is like the stories he told. Because, for example, I mean, Richard Hewson had a lot of memories about Thrillington and you know, really enjoyed delving into it. Whereas, of course, Herbie Flowers was such a prolific session musician. I don't think he could even remember the sessions.
Wow.
You know, he was doing like 5 bass playing sessions a day.
Right.
You know, in that era, and going from studio to studio. And of course, in a way, you know, that caught up with him in the end because he was getting paid by the hour.
Gotcha.
Of course, you know, cut forward 25 years later and Walk on the Wild Side's generated millions in radio play, and he'd still £5 for 1 hour's work, sort of thing. And in fact, I think he actually might have even won a case or lodged a case, you know, for certain royalty payments. But so he was interesting in that A, he couldn't remember at all, but B, you know, where was he now and what was he doing now? And he was doing a lot of work in music therapy.
Wow.
And going and playing guitar in prisons and rehabilitation. And
oh, wow.
He was quite keen to talk about that. And so we did.
Nice.
Yeah,
you mentioned that you were running a little late. How much time were you given by the publisher to have this book done?
Well, the standard thing, I think, for paperbacks is 9 months, which is another reason why it's like having a baby. And it definitely took longer than that. So, but then, like, I think all the time that Jeff Baker was keeping me hanging on for an interview, you know, I was keeping the publisher hanging on. You know, it didn't go ridiculously late.
Right.
But oh yeah, and the other thing, like, and then of course I suppose like drawing a stop is hard. You know, when you're
where do you stop? Yeah.
Right.
It's so for example, I remember at the end, I kind of thought, oh, you know, the book's written, but we need to sort of come in from a wider angle. So I went back and wrote the first chapter last.
Okay.
To kind of put something at the beginning to introduce everybody to it instead of just diving them straight in 1960 something. And then I think even when I'd written the first chapter, I thought, no, it's still not broad enough. We need to come in from a broader angle. So I went back and wrote another chapter before that. And then by that stage, you know, my head was so in it. I had this idea of like a sort of like an epilogue at the end where we went off and played tracks. Me went and played tracks to different musicians and different sort of avant-garde musicians and got their view on these tracks, and then at the end, you know, revealed to them that it was Paul McCartney to get like a separate view on what they'd listened to.
They thought of it, yeah.
Gotcha. So, you know, so talk about that feeling, you know, you decided, okay, the book is done, here it is. Were you comfortable with that, or did it seem like you felt like you needed to keep going with it?
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? I would have never stopped if they hadn't have, you know, wrestled it off of me. But then, you know, you have to draw a halt. And
you have to. It's just because it could just keep writing itself forever.
Right.
You know, there's so much you have to pick and choose. Okay, what am I going to take out and where am I going to stop? And, you know, deadlines are just, you know, unfortunately part of the, you know, that world. So
well, yeah, because at the end of the day, I suppose, like for me, it became like this complete sort of obsession, you know, and labor of love. But then you have to remind yourself that for Reynolds and Hearn, they need it out by Christmas,
right?
You know, because that's when people buy books.
Right. Do you know how many copies were made initially? The initial run. Do you know how many copies that they pressed?
No, I really don't. I couldn't. I think I might have done at the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that knowledge is long gone, unfortunately. How easy is it to get still? Is it? How did you?
Well, I mean, like I said, I mean, when I discovered the book, I discovered the book 2 years ago. Okay. But then I picked it up off of Amazon last year, I want to say, 2019. So, you know, I didn't have a problem. I mean, I don't know if anybody else is going to have a problem getting it, but if they were to look on Amazon, or if they were to look on probably eBay, they would probably be able to find copies. I mean, used copies, but at least, you know, you know, if they're interested in that world, you know, at least it's possible for them to get the book still, which is why I'm hoping that you will revisit this.
Yeah. Ian, do you have a backlog of supply of stock of your own books, or you don't have many copies, or just one, or that's it?
I think there's 2 or 3 in the house. So I found one to have a look at, and I've got to tell you, like, the funny thing about writing books is, once it is wrestled off you and it's over, I had to sort of flush it all out of my head.
Right.
You know, I mean, one thing that Reynolds and Hearn did really well was they put a great bit of promotion behind it.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah. So when it came out, you know, there was lots of interviews, like you know, radio interviews. There's a sort of journalist and presenter in the UK called Danny Baker. We had he was good, and the publicist warned me before he said, "Ian, you know, I'm going to warn you, Danny's going to go in hard. You know, he's going to make a big thing of, like, you know, this is all crazy off the wall stuff, and a book shouldn't have been written about it." I was like, great, you know, let's have a go. And we had like a really interesting you know, debate on the radio. But so after it came out and there was this sort of blitz, then it became quite hard for me to think about it, if I'm honest. You know, it all been sort of very draining. But what's cool is people did end up quite liking it. You know, so every few years someone emails and says, you know, I really enjoyed that book. And I suppose it's quite heartening, because I always thought, well, now this has been done, everyone will know, and like every McCartney book from now on will have the avant-garde section, and But
Right.
what's it hasn't, has it really? It's sort of
No, it hasn't.
it's carried on flying under the radar a little
Very
bit.
much so. Very much so.
Yeah, which is, I suppose, quite good. But yeah.
Good and bad. Very much like, again, like known and unknown. It's very much like life imitating art a little bit, right?
Because you know when I'm not saying I Google myself, because obviously people shouldn't do that. But if you Google unknown Paul McCartney, which I thought I'd do in preparation for this interview, I thought, well, maybe we'll find some references. But of course, what you get if you Google unknown Paul McCartney is when he did the track with was it Rihanna and Kanye West?
Right.
And someone did a tweet saying, "Oh, isn't it great that Rihanna's discovered this unknown guitarist called Paul McCartney," and it became like a sort of viral thing.
Yeah.
The unknown phrase picked up.
It picked up, yeah.
Interesting. So let's talk about what you're doing now. I mean, what are you working on? Is there anything else you wanna promote that you're doing?
What am I working on at the moment? Well, here's one of the things that I'm working on at the moment is I think when this book had come out, like I was saying, I'd not long interviewed Trevor Horn about ZTT, and that was like my sort of entry point into sort of left field music. And then cut forward a few years later, and I was working there in the studio and running that label, and then I went off and did other things. And
at Trevor Horn studio?
Yeah.
At Storm? At Storm, right? Yeah.
Storm West, yeah. I was one of the last people in the building before they knocked it down.
Wow.
Yeah. In fact, the last time I was there, I went with Trevor's son to look at the flattened Psalm West.
Yeah.
Which was sad for me, but he seemed unfazed.
How was Trevor? Did Trevor ever speak freely about his period in Yes there, or he didn't like talking about it?
No. I mean, I don't think it was a period that he looks back on hugely fondly. But generally, out of difficult things, come great things.
Yeah.
So, he told me once, we were talking about The Art of Noise, and he said, well, I think when he delivered 90125 to was it Atlantic Records, and Atlantic hated it, and when Atlantic hated the first mixes of that record, he was so incensed. He went with the most craziest avant-garde cut and paste music he could to sort of vent his anger.
Oh, really?
And that's what became the first Art of Noise album. But no, so in terms of where I am now, I'm starting to revisit all of that. So I'm working with, I'm doing a lot of work right now with 808 State, who are one of the ZTT groups. And the plan with 808 is to put their entire catalogue on digital. So I've currently got a spreadsheet of about 150 tracks that need to come to Spotify that I'm working through. So, lots of different things. I suppose, like the other thing, I suppose, to mention that's more to do with all of this is, so I set up and founded a couple of music magazines about 5 or 6 years ago. So there's one magazine called Classic Pop that's been going a good few years. That's doing quite well. And that actually had a spin-off magazine called Long Live Vinyl, which I think has been going as a monthly magazine now for about 4 years.
Okay.
Lots of projects.
Cool. Okay. Well, we will definitely promote those when we post this too.
Right. And we'll definitely, we'll bug you like every couple months. We'll say, hey, have you started part 2 yet? Have you started part 2 yet?
Well, there's part 2, and there's like, at one point I had this crazy idea, which is like, should we go like full cinema scope and do the avant-garde Beatles? And maybe follow through, like to have all the George stuff and all the John stuff.
Put it under one
and
thing.
then obviously all of the Paul stuff as well. But wow, that would be a big undertaking. You know, it really would.
It would, but maybe a little easier for you these days, thanks to that lovely invention called the internet.
Yeah, no, it definitely will be a little bit easier. So I must say, it's great talking to two people who are open-minded and enough to be really into the unknown McCartney. That's great.
Yeah, I mean, it's really surprising how, just growing up, I grew up in Michigan, where just Motown and pure rock and roll, and and then over the years, you just you want to discover more music, and then especially if your favorite musician just veers off in different genres. I look forward to that, and that's what I want for my favorite musicians, is to have them try different things. And obviously McCartney has done that throughout his whole career, and that's why I'm grateful that we have this book, so we can read about those and how those projects come to be, and bring some light to them. So we're ever grateful for you.
We will make the unknown known.
Yes.
That's the plan.
Right. So we want to thank you very much for joining us. Andy, was there anything else you wanted to add before we?
No, Ian, thanks so much for coming on. It's been a wonderful experience going down the history of this project that you've done and who you've worked with, especially. Loved hearing the Trevor Horn bit, because I'm a huge Yes fan as well, so I liked that quite a bit. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you, guys.
You're on social media? Do you want anybody to know where they can follow you?
Email you or kind of ask you about the book, because we're going to push the book too, the links and so forth.
Oh, please. Probably the thing to do is to go to longlivevinyl.net.
Okay.
That's a good outpost.
Okay.
Or classicpopmag.com.
Awesome. I'm going to write those down now so we have them.
Yeah, but those are two good links.
Great,
cool. Well, we really appreciate it you taking the time. This is a great conversation about the book. Obviously, we don't want to dive too much into it, because we want people to actually buy the book and read it. And plus it's been 18 years too since it came out. So
it's really good fun to talk about it again. And I must admit, reading and putting my head back in that world, I've really enjoyed it. Like, every time I've read bits of it since I wrote it, I've sort of, like, I don't know, if you do a project and you go back and you can only see the mistakes,
Right.
I think it's long enough now where you just think, oh, actually, this is really cool. You enjoy it.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you once again. So this is Ian Peel. We want to thank him very much for joining us and talking about his book, The Unknown McCartney and the Avantgarde. For us, Two Legs, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Two Legs Podcast. You can find us on YouTube at Two Legs, a Paul McCartney podcast. So please check us out there and subscribe to that channel. We're going to have a subscribers contest here soon coming up. We're coming up on a year on YouTube here, Andy, soon. So it's hard to believe that we've been working together now for, I believe this is our 9th month or something like that. Working together, and we had a lot of fun doing that. So go over and check us out on YouTube at Two Legs, a Paul McCartney podcast. You can email us at twolegspodcast@gmail.com. And we've got a lot of great more episodes coming up, and we look forward to seeing you guys in the future. Thanks for all the new listeners. We appreciate you having here. We appreciate you being here and listening, and keep sending those emails. Keep on responding to the YouTube videos. We really appreciate hearing all your comments. So once again, everybody, thanks for joining us. And for Ian, for Andy, I'm Tom. And as usual, have a great day and a beautiful night. Take care.
listening to Two Legs, a Paul McCartney podcast, hosted by Tom Hunyadi and Andy Nichols, with musical contributions by Dylan